is fused applique? Fused applique, or what is often referred to as raw edge applique, is really just gluing two pieces of fabric together. But the glue that's used is typically a fusible web, which is clean, easy to apply, and even, so the fabric is perfectly flat. Fused applique uses the process of applying the fusible web to fabric, cutting the fabric out into shapes, removing the paper backing, and fusing that fabric onto another fabric. So what's fusible web? Fusible web is a webbed adhesive that melts and sticks when it's heated. That heat can be applied with an iron or with a heat gun, like a hairdryer for crafting. Fabric pieces can be backed with fusible web and then placed onto another fabric. When ironed, the two fabrics fuse together. Fabric textures can be created using a heat gun and fusible web as tools, but I won't be talking about that in detail in this video. While fusible web can act like an interfacing, it's different from interfacing because it's always paper backed and it's always heat activated. So what are my fusible web options? Fusible web is available in sheets or rolls, and some brands can be purchased off the bolt by the yard. Pallen Wonder Under fusible web leaves fabric flexible, but the edges can fray more easily. Heat and Bond Light for lightweight, and Ultra Hold for heavier weight iron-on adhesive. Gives really clean edges, but it can become stiff. Flexifuse lightweight fusible web. This is a newer product. It claims to be less sticky. Mistifuse white sheer fusible webbing leaves fabric fusible. Steam-A-Seam 2 double stick fusible web. With this one, sheets can actually be run through the printer, although it's somewhat sticky. Shades Textiles Soft Fuse. Very soft and flexible. So how do we use this fusible web? First, have a shape ready. This shape can be from a pattern, but more typically when creating art quilts, it's a bit of a design or a section that is being used to fill an area, so the shape is not always as obvious. It could even be a tiny little sliver. There are two sides to a sheet of fusible web. One side is the paper, which should feel smooth, and the other side is the exposed fusible, which should feel rough. The rough side should be the side adhered to the back side of your first fabric. So there's more than one way to create this shape. In the first method, you can place the shape under the fusible web and trace the shape onto the paper side of the fusible web, in reverse. The reason it is traced in reverse is because the fabric will be wrong side up when the fusible is ironed on. So after you cut the shape out and flip the fabric right side up, the shape will flip. The second method to create the shape is to adhere the fusible web to the fabric without tracing a pattern, then turning the fabric right side up and creating the shape freeform or mark on the top of the fabric itself. In either scenario, the wrong side of the fabric will be ironed onto the rough side of the fusible web and adhered using heat, typically an iron. To iron the fusible on, place the fabric right side down on a pressing board and place the fusible web rough side down onto the fabric. That's paper side up. So the wrong side of the fabric and the rough side of the fusible web are touching. Press with an iron to completely adhere. Refer to the instructions of your brand for specifics, but the iron is usually dry, no steam, and at a medium-high heat setting. Do not touch the iron to the fusible web, as it will melt onto the sole of the iron and create quite a mess. Try to avoid ironing the fusible side onto the pressing board, but if that accidentally happens, it isn't too terrible to remove it. To protect your iron and other surfaces, you can overlay your project with a sheet of parchment paper. When you start designing for applique, the easiest thing to do is to use an illustration or a drawing that looks like a coloring page. So I went out and I looked for a coloring page of a carousel horse, and the Carousel Horse drawing is simple lines with detailed lines over that, and it can be broken down into pieces. So what I've done is created a series of layers of different shapes to create and build up this Carousel Horse using those shapes. So if you look at the Carousel Horse, there is the horse's body, and then there's also this leg here and leg here that goes behind, so it's kind of like an underneath layer. There is the pole that the Carousel Horse is mounted on. There's the tail and the mane, the bridle, and the saddle. So each of those pieces can be broken down. So I've done it in layers, and I've used some editing software to create those layers, and then I've printed them out at the size that I want. So I'm using my technology. You can also do this by making multiple copies in the size that you want and then separating those copies into the different shapes and layers. There's more than one way to get to this point. So I have my Carousel Horse broken down, and here I've colored the different layers that I'm using. So I have the layer that has the pole, the legs, and the tail, and those are going to be the first layer that I lay down. Then I have the body layer, and the body layer is going to be all one piece, and that's the second layer I'm going to lay down. Then I've got these little bits. I've got the bridle, and I've got these sashings that go underneath the saddle. And then here's my saddle, and then finally the mane. So I've just rough sketched a color in there. That's not the color I'm going to use with fabric. It just tells me that that's the layer that I need to be working with at that time. So what I'm first going to do is I'm going to choose some fabrics for the tail, for the body, including these two back legs, and for the pole. And then I'm going to use paper-backed fusible web and trace these shapes, the larger shapes, onto that fusible web, and then adhere that to the fabric. Alright, so I am incredibly prepared, and I have a lot of fusible web. Just kidding, this is the last piece I have, and I forgot to go shopping for more. So what I'm going to do is trace the largest piece first, so I make sure that I have enough fusible web for the smaller pieces. So I'm going to lay the fusible web on top of the drawing. Now what's going to happen is once I cut this out of the fabric will be on the other side, so it will be reversed image. So my horse will actually be facing left, even though my drawing is facing right. And I'm just going to trace around. You don't need a light box, you don't need a window for this, because you have your drawing on the paper and the coloring pages. The coloring outline is usually pretty strong, or if you draw your own design, you can draw a dark line around your design so that you have a strong line to trace. So you don't need a light box for this. You don't need any special equipment. You don't need to hold it up to the window. You just need to lay it on a flat surface and then trace around the lines of the drawing onto the paper side of the fusible web. I'm trying to do this fairly quickly. This will be a rough carousel horse. So now I have the entire line sketched out. And what I'm going to do is just cut around that line so that I have some other fusible web that I can use for the other shapes. So I've chosen some fabric for the body of the Carousel Horse, and I'll also use this same fabric for the two separate legs. So I'm going to, first of all, flip the fabric to the wrong side. You do not want to attach the fusible web to the right side of the fabric. That will completely destroy your day. So you have to apply the fusible web to the wrong side of the fabric. And here I have my fusible web horse, and I've traced it, and you can feel that one edge of the fusible web is textured, and then one side is up the paper. So you draw on the paper and you iron on the paper. If you were to press your iron to this side, it would create a sticky, horrible mess. That is not what you want. Another thing that would destroy your day. So again, you attach the fusible web to the wrong side of the fabric and you draw and press on the paper. Now the way fusible web works is that it's actually a sheet of glue. And that glue is paper backed. So that paper will end up peeling off to expose the other side of the glue that you will then use to adhere to your next piece of fabric. Now it's curling up because I'm at the end of the roll. Remember, I'm out of fusible web. That's why it's curling up like that. But if I just take my iron and I press it down and flatten it out, it will immediately go flat because the iron and the heat have melted that glue side onto the fabric. So remember, always press on the paper. And some people actually press. I iron. It's not going to hurt anything as long as it's down. You're not shifting it around at all. It's fine. Dry iron though, no steam, no moisture. And I've tried all different kinds of fusible web, and I just keep my iron at the hottest setting. But follow the instructions. So now you have this piece of fusible web attached to the fabric. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut carefully around that drawing on the paper part of the fusible web, and that will be my shape for this piece of the applique. Now I have all of my shapes traced out, so I'm just going to start adhering the fusible web to all of those fabrics. So I've picked out my fabrics. I'm using kind of a goldish spotted fabric for the pole of my Carousel Horse. And remember, I am ironing and pressing to the wrong side of the fabric, but when I flip it over, I can kind of see that I'm lining it up on some of the gold spots. So those gold spots will become that carousel pole. I'm just going to move these out of the way. And then I have my mane and tail. And the mane and the tail are going to be this kind of bluish green batik. And with batiks, it's a little hard to tell what the front and what the back is, but I'm going to say that that's the front. So I'm going to flip it over and press my tail onto the back. And I'm kind of placing it a little bit so that I know where my color is landing. So it's a little bit of kind of fussy pressing. So there's the tail. And then this will be the mane. So in order to fit that piece on my fabric, it has to kind of go like that. So the mane and the tail will be the same fabric. then I have the two legs that are showing up behind the body. And I'm still using the same fabric that I used for the body. So again, press the fusible web onto the wrong side and on the paper. Always press on the paper. And then I have the saddle. Now the saddle does have little separate parts to it, but I decided what I'm going to do is just make the base saddle out of one fabric, and then I will embellish afterwards. So part of the fun of quilts, art quilting and making quilts, is the embellishment. So you can definitely add to each image as you go. The one layer of the fabric that's on the Fusible is not necessarily the final layer. And I've chosen this really fun like nighttime sky fabric that I'm going to use for the saddle, and kind of fussy pressing a little bit, placing it where I want, and then pressing the fusible web. It really goes quickly if you have all of the pieces already kind of established and set up. The pressing part really goes fast. And then I think I'm going to use the same fabric for the bridle. So the bridle is kind of thin sections, thin segments. So I'm going to line that up and use the same fabric for the bridle. So the bridle and the saddle are both this dark blue, kind of nighttime. And then for the other parts of the saddle, there's like a strap that goes underneath the Carousel Horse, and there is a piece that goes from the main harness of the bridle over to the horse's mouth. And I'm going to make those out of this like starry fabric. So it's a little bit lighter in color, but it's still kind of that nighttime sky feel. And those are little tiny pieces. But I'm not at my tiniest piece yet. So the last piece that I have as an actual fusible is the horse's eye. And I think what I'm going to do is use the same fabric that I'm using for the saddle and the bridle, and just place that eye over a piece of fabric that is the darkest piece. So it's definitely a dark eye piece. So I've placed it right there. And see what I just did? So I placed it paper side down and I tried to press on the paper. That did not work because what it ended up doing is actually melting on my iron. So this is why we press on the paper side. Because if you press on the rough side of that fusible web, you're actually melting the glue. And melting the glue onto your iron will make a bit of a mess. Thankfully that was a really tiny, tiny piece, so I didn't get a whole lot of glue on the tip of my iron, but that's definitely something to be cautious about. All of my applique shapes and pieces have been traced from the original pattern, have been backed with a fusible web. So I pressed fusible web onto the wrong side of the fabric, and then each piece has been cut out along the pattern that I traced. So the next step is to lay out all of your pieces in the design, and I've already done that with most of the Carousel Horse. I like to take all of the paper off of the back before I lay it out, because I don't want to repeat the process of laying it out once I have everything placed where I want it. So I take off the paper. I know some people leave the paper on and then replace everything, but I like to just take off the paper and say this is where I'm going to put it, and then when everything is in place, I will go ahead and press it. So the paper just peels off the back, so you can lift up an edge of the paper and then it peels right off, and then that exposes the glue, the adhesive side of the fusible web. And then I'm going to place the final piece, which in my case is the mane, and I'm going to tuck it underneath the horse's face, and then it's actually going to come over and around. And then it comes down over the, it covers a good chunk of the saddle, and it will cover part of the pole as well. So once I'm happy with that placement, I want to make sure that there's no visible lines between the connecting pieces so that they overlap if they need to. Once I'm happy with that, I will press it in place. And here I am going to press, because if I do iron, which means moving back and forth, if I do iron, I will probably jiggle some of those pieces out of position, and I don't want to do that. So the final applique pressing is indeed a press, where I lift up and press down. Lift up and press down. And I just want to make sure every piece that I have placed, I've already removed the paper from all of them, but I want to make sure every piece that I have placed is in fact fused. So the fusible web will fuse to the backing fabric with heat. The glue will melt, just like it did when you were applying it to the top applique piece, so that when you lift up your project, everything will be in place and you won't be able to knock anything off. So now the applique is complete, and my next step for this Carousel Horse art quilt is embellishment. So thread painting, attaching, using different types of thread techniques, maybe painting. I'd like to make these dark. I don't necessarily want to add another piece of fabric on top, so I might use some kind of painting effect to make those dark. There are some details that I'd like to add to the saddle and the harnesses, and there's some additional detail lines for the mane and the tail, as well as these lines that go on the pole. So all of that embellishing will happen on top of the fused applique, but before the piece is quilted.